Greetings, comrades. Bienvenidos. Welcome to this week's episode of Red Library, a political education podcast for today's left. We have a very, very special two-parter coming your way starting today, starting right now as you're listening to this, because it depends on when you download and listen, but the now is always right now. We have two very special new guests in the library, my very good comrades Nakia and Stephanie, and they're here to help us tackle our very first listener-requested episode. We're going to be doing a read-through of Adrienne Maree Brown's Emergent Strategy, Shaping Change, Changing Worlds, published by AK Press, I believe, in 2015. This one is going to cover a whole range of things, and I think it's a pretty fantastic combination of content from the book, some of its ideas, the spirit of liberation that it's trying to translate in terms of practices and a vision of the world that we could have, that we could create together, along with a good dose of our own personal experiences in leftist activism and organizing here in Central Texas, whether it be in Austin or San Antonio and the surrounding areas. So it's that very special combination of theory and action, what we call praxis in the Marxist vernacular, and it is a hell of a lot of fun, and we're very, very excited to bring this one to you today. Part 2 will be coming out next week, so if you enjoyed this one, please make sure to stick around for that one. And if you're listening on our new YouTube page, remember that we post the first part on the page, but to get the second parts, you have to find us on iTunes or whatever other podcast catcher you use. So come find us, track us down. I mean, that sounds a little ominous and threatening, you know what I mean. Subscribe. Don't come to my house or anyone else's house who's associated with the show. All right, y'all, let's get into the episode. But before we do that, remember to support the show by subscribing on any podcast app that you use, whether it's on an iPhone or on the Android. Remember, go down to the little section at the bottom and click on one of those stars. Give us those reviews as it gets us into more potential listeners' podcast feeds and helps get more exposure to the show and spread our message. Head over to Patreon, and for as little as $1 a month, you can get access to our Patreon-exclusive episodes, and we should have our new one coming out not too long after you're listening to this episode. Remember, like the page on Facebook, find us on Twitter, and at this point, I usually have a whole range of other suggestions of what to do to support the show, but really just listen to this episode and try to take some of it in and figure out ways to apply it in your own work out there. I think that's the best thing to do. All right, y'all, without further ado, here's me and comrades Nakia and Stephanie talking about Adrienne Maree Brown's Emergent Strategy, Shaping Change, Changing Worlds, Part 1. We'll see you back here afterward. Hey everybody, welcome to this week's episode of Red Library, a political education podcast for today's left. I have two brand new guests to the show, two of my most esteemed colleagues, esteemed comrades. I will let them weave their magic and introduce themselves. Say hi to everybody.
Hi everyone, my name is Nakia Winfield. I am a social worker and I do a lot of work where I look at social systems and analyze power dynamics in them. So maybe more of what I do will come out. I feel like I wear a lot of hats.
I'm Stephanie Rodriguez. Yeah, same. I work a lot in advocacy-related things and organizing and yeah, I think things just come up sort of as they go because there are a lot of things that are sort of unspoken and yeah.
One of the things I'm really excited about doing this book with y'all and having y'all here to lead myself and our comrade listeners through it is that, well, you know each other through various organizing work. And then I think I've met both of you through various kinds of organizing work. So we also are like doing things outside of, the show and doing some work together. So would y'all maybe just want to share a little bit about how y'all met and like some of the organizing work that you've done or are doing?
So we both do anti-racism work with Undoing Racism. We've both been resource trainers for Undoing Racism. I've been doing that for about 2 years now. So I'm also part of, this is Nakia, sorry. I'm part of Undoing Racism Austin, which is the organizing leg of doing the Undoing Racism and community organizing training. And so we've been working with the city of Austin to put on Undoing Racism trainings and to organize around them and to get community in the room for these trainings. And Stephanie was in the room a couple of times when we've been doing these ones that have been organized with the city, and that's how we met initially. Do you want to say anything about it?
Comments?
Thoughts? Yeah, I mean, I guess going into like what being in the workshop was, or what it's looked like for us connecting as a result of that. Other work that I've been doing, I feel like has been more of connecting with people directly and not online, and doing things really more in person and creating circles and space for dialogue around the full moon and doing things like that in connection, but doing it in a way that is open to everyone and is centered around queer folks of color, but that it is welcoming everyone versus what I feel usually happens, which is like a lot of women have access to circles and spaces for support that we don't often see open to everyone.
Can you talk a little bit about your connections with the Indigenous community in Austin and like some of the events that you've had, or like the...
Oh my gosh, yeah.
And then like the sweat lodges and like how all of that comes into play with this.
So that's something exciting that's going on. And so I came into ceremony through the Peace and Dignity Journey, which you can find them online. Basically, it happens every 4 years, and it's been happening since the early 90s. And I'm like, I'm not the one to be talking about it. I have friends actually that are very involved with organizing for that and things like that. But this is all to say that it was actually at Resistencia, in the location that they just got gentrified out of, that I connected to ceremony. And that was like the connection to other things that Nakia knows about and things like that we've shared as far as going to Sweat Lodge and what that looks like in my life. But what I was really excited about that I was going to share in connection with San Antonio is that they have what's called the Sanarte Clínicas in the Plaza Guadalupe. And so basically they've been bridging traditional medicine with Western medicine in a way of having like vitals and check-ins and all of that, but also having limpias and body work and sound healing and all of these, you know, like herbs and supplements in that way. Yeah, and just providing this holistic support in a way that I haven't seen before, that I think is really new. And so, yeah, just trying to get more support from the city and from the community. And I've been going out to that clinic. I actually just missed it's been happening since earlier this year, and it's going to be going on until October. I just missed the last one because I was in Colombia. But other than that, I've been out there supporting because I feel like it's really important. You know, San Antonio is only about an hour away. Just supporting organizing work happening out there. The Indigenous community is doing a lot of really beautiful work and a lot of really beautiful weaving. And so I love connecting with friends back and forth.
Thank you for talking about that, because I feel like there's different ways in which we approach our work, right? And I think that your way is like really about connecting with Indigenous communities and traditions and like ceremony and being able to see healing through that way. I feel like I don't do as much of that, and I really appreciate you doing it. And like my work has been often through like, so I just got, I ended a contract with the City of Austin Equity Office because I was getting the Austin Police Department to go through the equity tool, and there was a lot of really great opportunity for community capacity building and getting them on the same page to get to the point where they were able to go, hey, APD, like I want these things to be happening, or you need to be answering these questions in this way for us to be able to like review your things. And it's just a very different way to do the work, right? Like I'm going to directly hold these people accountable and look at their policies and procedures and like be really into the city. And then there's also this other piece that I think is really important of like, I'm going to go back to my roots and healing and like remembering who I am and my connection to earth and ceremony and like humanity. And I feel like they're both really important.
If at all possible, just because y'all are doing so much interesting work in like different capacities, in the show notes I usually like to put things for people to check out and like read up on that we mentioned. So maybe I can share some resources or just things that people can go to and like learn more about some of the different work that y'all are doing too.
Yes. Cool. There's also, so I'm going to tell them about the thing that we're going to do on November 2nd.
Yes.
So there's two things. One is when we do an Undoing Racism training, there's supposed to be debriefs. And for a long time, there were not debriefs debriefs. And so for the ones with the city, we're starting to do debriefs again, which is really great. And we usually have a 2-hour debrief. We've done 2 of them that are 2-hour debriefs. And this September 28th, we're going to do a 4-hour debrief. And we're going to talk about how that's going to look different, like tomorrow or on Tuesday, and figure out what the framework is for that. So we're going to do a 4-hour debrief. And then on November 2nd, we're going to start doing these circles. So when Undoing Racism Austin started initially, because it's like started and then ended and then came back, one of the things that happened was there was a break off for Undoing White Supremacy Austin. And they've been doing these unlearning circles.
I've actually participated in some of those too.
Oh, awesome. Yeah. I went to go visit the unlearning circles. Usually I'm just like, so the unlearning circles are like spaces for white people to be able to like process and like talk to other white people about their white people bullshit, right? And like, what does white supremacy look like on a day-to-day, et cetera. And so whenever I see that, I'm like, yes, I'm so glad that y'all are doing that. And then I'm also like, damn it, like, why are there not places for like people of color to go to have that same experience right after an Undoing Racism training? And so we're going to try to do a multiracial one on November 2nd and have like a similar, we don't know how exactly we're going to have it different, but like it's going to be very similar to the unlearning circles where you get to process things. So hopefully y'all will be able to join us if you've already done an Undoing Racism training.
Maybe on that note, since we are starting off talking about just the actual like material, like concrete work that y'all are doing, that's a good segue into what we're here to talk about today, which is very much on organizing and how this stuff looks in practice, and maybe it'll be very reflective of the actual work that y'all do on the ground. So what are we here to talk about today?
Emergent strategy. I'm actually going to let Stephanie go first because I'm really curious about her thoughts on the book. I know my thoughts already, and I talk a lot, so I want to know what's up.
You're in the hot seat now.
Yeah.
No, yeah, it's all good. I'm just like, I'm curious to see what comes from this conversation. Yeah, I've traveled with this book a bit, and I feel like we've been places together. Like it was a whole experience. I think it was really affirming in the way that we envision shifting the future that we want to live in, and seeing that articulated in a way that really connects with the way that I express myself and different things like that. Like, yeah, it was really refreshing in that way. I was like, wait, hey, you know, this other level of inspiration of people always being like, oh, write a book and share your story and all these things. And I feel like when I see writing like this that feels so accessible to everyone, that sense of your voice in whatever way that it shows through is perfectly fine, and that it does deserve to be shared. And yeah, I love that.
So like what were your like large takeaways from the book, and like how do you see it relating to like leftist work and movement building?
I feel like I need to do more writing. I feel like I need to dig into a lot of the questions that are there. And I think that that's part of just like constantly evolving, right? In whatever our thoughts are, in whatever way that we see the world, that we're constantly in this like exploration.
Yeah. So I love this book. I feel like I probably should have tried to get some royalties out of Adrienne Maree Brown because I've told so many people about this book.
Well, if she listens to this episode, you should
probably no.
Getting some of that money.
I funny enough, I don't think that she liked me very much. So I just went to this this emergent strategy facilitation workshop, which was in Detroit, and it was 4 days, and it was really good. And like she says that her superpower is making people be able to fall in love with each other in the room that she's facilitating, and she's really good at that. But I think that like personally, she was not a big fan of me, and like I'm fine with that, right? Like that's cool. So I'm just like, keep your money, you've earned it, and more. She's doing a lot of really amazing work. But I feel like the workshop really went with the book in that, like, it's a different, like Stephanie said, it's a different way to envision the future. And I think that for a lot of leftist movements, what I'm seeing is like a different lens, or like a different goal with the same strategy and the same framework, and we're just moving the lens a little bit, and somebody else is going to have power now, but we're going to keep it authoritarian, and it's going to be, you know, like a lot of the same systems. It's just that there's going to be a power shift. And I feel like the book is like, no, like totally different systems, totally different ways of doing things. So one of the things that struck me from the the actual workshop that resonates in the book is this idea of like, again, like these different ways of doing things. So we talk about white supremacy culture and undoing racism and other places. And this is like the air that we breathe and the water that we swim in. And so it's really hard to be able to go, like, what exactly are these behaviors and how could they look different? And one of the things about the workshop is, like, we started out, like, there was an altar. There were crystals on the altar. There's Palo Santo on the altar. There's, like, water on the altar that, like, gets changed out. Like, we talked a lot about energy. We opened the day with a tarot card. And this is way more woo that I am used to, right? Like, I do facilitation work as, like, my job. And I can't imagine, like, going into these places that have asked for facilitation and being like, we're going to start with this tarot card and like see what these people have to say to me, right? But it really worked for the space, and it worked for the people who were in the space, because they were all people of color who were really also invested in other ways of being and knowing and talking about energies and like talking about connection to land, whether that be a land acknowledgement or like horoscopes and like what sign you are, and having different connections in that way. And so I really loved being able to be a part of that, because it was like, this is kind of the antithesis of white organizational culture.
Yeah, actually, if you don't mind, since I'm kind of in the place of the learner for this episode, I was curious about that, because one of the things I was most fascinated about reading this book and hopefully was wanting us to talk about and hear y'all's thoughts on is, what is this sort of an antidote to? And I guess whenever y'all found this book, and it seems like it resonated really strongly with you both, what was it about the book that seemed to pose a sort of different lens, a different view of how organizing typically goes, and what is it sort of doing differently?
Yeah. Do you want to, get it?
I'm like, yes.
Say it.
Go.
Yeah, I just feel like in general, the way that we speak of organizing and things like that, it's like sacrificial and like, if you're not getting burnt out, you're not doing it right kind of mentality. Yeah. And that just doesn't resonate with me at all. Like, so that's in one of those ways, that's how I felt like this was really validating, where it's just like, no, actually peel back that shame of wanting to enjoy all of these aspects and complexities of your life, and that this can actually look really beautiful and be done in a creative way that feels nourishing and expanding, and not at all like what we've been conditioned to believe organizing has to look like. Yeah. And for me, that's been a huge thing that's been present, is this like desire, like allowing ourselves to desire, because desire has been this very like religious thing that's imposed as something that is negative, versus that being a part of our right and our process to envision different futures and like be able to be creative and like just be in a different space. And I'm like,
I just have to say really quickly, one of the things that I talk about most on this show, because I come from a very like Marxist perspective, but one of the things I talk a lot about is there's this strain that happens in a lot of very like modern Marxist thinking about, we've lost the ability to imagine the future, or this idea that the ability to think about a sort of radical positive change about how we live our day-to-day lives in the future is something that it's very difficult for us to find a way to feel that on a very deep visceral level. And it's really cool to hear you talk about it this way, because in some way, like, it's aiming at the same sort of thing. It's like, how do we rediscover what that feels like and rediscover that as a way to change how we live every aspect of our life. So it's pretty cool how this fits like right into all the other stuff that we're doing on the show, because it's very much about this.
Yeah. There's a part on page 67 or 64 that talks about in a successful Rekus action, the visions and the solutions are deeper and more compelling than the injustice. And I think that really speaks to that part, right? Like we focus so much on like, what is the work? What has happened? All of these terrible bad things.
Everything is damage control.
Right. Or damage control, harm reduction, and like plugging leaks in these boats. And it's not about like what can be. And so like it ends up where your life is just about struggle and the work is just about work and more work and more work. And again, you have this shame of like, oh, you're taking a break, like you're enjoying something. How can you enjoy things when children are in cages, right? Yeah. Like, and so there, I was thinking about when I was coming on the show, I'm like, am I going to read this part? And I'm going to do it.
Yeah,
so,
I was really hoping you were going to read this part.
So there is every time I tell people about the book, I'm like, there's a piece on page 55 that really resonates with me. I literally wake up to it every morning and it says, how many of us feel and can say, I am living a life I don't regret, a life that will resonate with my ancestors and with as many generations forward as I can imagine, that I am attending to the crises of my time with my best self, that I am of communities that are doing our collective best to honor our ancestors and all humans to come. And I remember reading that to a friend of mine, and he was like, oh, that sounds like so much work. Like, can't people just be? And I'm like, no, like, you don't understand. It's not just about doing the work. Like, that talks about, like, bringing your best self to the crises of your time. Yes. And, like, yes, there is so much work to be done, but it's also a thing where, like, living a life that resonates with your ancestors isn't just, like, work all of the time. Yeah. It's, like, eating delicious ice cream and, like, watching the flavors explode in your mouth, and it's, like, rolling around in a field of bluebonnets, and it's, like, hugging your family and, like, making really sweet love, like, as the sun comes up, and, like, going kayaking, and, like, all of these wonderful things that, like, really is about living fully, right? And I feel like I would really love to see that as part of leftist movements about, like, no, we're really digging deep into the culture of, like, why it is that it's so important. It's not just about, like, not being in pain anymore. It's about thriving. And I feel like that's so important to this work.
You know, in a really interesting way, whenever you read that quote to me for the first time, and I've thought a lot about how that in some ways answers this huge gap, I think, in most of the leftist groups that I've participated in, which, you know, tend to be, like, very, like, hardcore left. But there is this way that we take on this almost sort of, like you said, Stephanie, like this sacrificial sort of like martyr kind of complex about the work that we do. And I think we've lost any idea or any connection to this idea that what we're engaging in and what we're aiming for is a process of liberation. Mm-hmm. And to me, you know, this is why I got involved in, like, leftist politics in the first place, because there was always this idea that at the heart of this, we're trying to figure out what does it mean to live a liberated sort of existence, a liberated life. Mm-hmm. And if we're not talking about those aspects and having that almost like spiritual connection to it, then, you know, we're missing something really vital. And it's maybe not a surprise that we're getting burnt out, but also that maybe our movements aren't going where we want them to go, right? Because they're not speaking to the things that we all deeply need.
Right. So one of the things that I really love about this book and that about Adrienne Maree Brown is that she helped to co-edit or co-curate Octavius Brood.
Oh, yeah.
Which, for people who don't know, it is it's Octavia Butler style Afrofuturism, right? Like sci-fi where people of the African diaspora get to exist. Who knew? And not only exist, but to thrive. Like, there's one of the stories that talks about people who are differently abled. Like, one person has vision issues, another person has mobility issues, and somebody else has, like, other issues. And, like, they have this world where they work together and they just help each other in different ways. And it's this idea that, like, they can't exist without each other. Like, they're interdependent, and not in this way of resentment, but in this way of, like, thriving, right? And we talk a lot about in the book about, like, how to imagine that future, and, like, where are we going to go if we can't imagine something different, right?
I love where all that is going. I guess what really came up for me was that talking about spirituality and how, like, taboo that can be, and that being such a key missing element that I feel like I see often is, like, it doesn't have to be religious. It's actually, like, better for us to be able to move towards this connection to the land, right? That ultimately, like, that connection to the land that can be, just more open is going to bring us back to our roots. I feel like what happens oftentimes is that there's this sense of, like, spirit missing. And at the very core of things, that, like, if we were able to address it, would allow us to really shift certain dynamics. I don't know if that makes sense. Does what I'm saying make sense to y'all?
No, it does. And I think that it also talks, like, it speaks to the biomimicry in the book. Like, when you have a connection to land, you see all of these things, like, intuitively, like, you're seeing it on a regular basis. So not even just the elements, like the fractal, adaptive, interdependent, and decentralization, but, like, they talk about complex movements and, like, how we work similar to other things that are already present in nature. Ferns are a form of fractal. A fractal is an object or quantity that displays self-similarity, which means that it looks roughly the same at any scale. Small-scale solutions impact the whole system, use similar principles to build at L scales, right? Or like ants, and ant societies function through individual ants acting collectively in accord with a simple local information to carry on all of their survival activities. Every ant relies on the work of others in producing their own work, cooperative work, and collective sustainability, right? Like if you are in contact with with nature, you're seeing these things happen, and like it's not this thing that's really foreign to you. But I think that our separation from land and separation from nature, and like living in a city, means that like you don't have these things that you're looking at on a regular basis, and so you don't have these models to go like this is what already works, you know?
I was curious, since the book is called Emergent Strategy, if how you all would describe, just really basically for someone who's listening who, hasn't read the book but wants to learn about some of the basic concepts, and enough that they could sort of start to really think about them and maybe change their own way of seeing things. Like, how would y'all describe what emergent strategy is, and why that for Brown's sort of whole way of visioning this stuff?
I think if I was going to use like a quick word, I would say like letting go of rigidity and just like allowing space for that fluidity in terms of just like going into it in that way, I think is really, really useful. Like the way that she talks about creating agendas and all of these things, like I'm thinking of not going into it with all these hard boundaries, because there's so much that is just like totally different and opening us up to the possibilities of what these strategies can look like in our organizations in different contexts and all these things, right? Where she's saying that's the whole point. Like I can give you these tools and you go see what's up, what happens, what that evolves into.
Yeah, I feel like same. So when we're talking about strategy like this, we're talking about the way that we move through the world. Like, what is the plan, right? And a lot of times, especially in agendas, like we have plans that are given to us, right? Like, I'm going to tell you what the plan is. I already know what the plan is. Like, you might have a little bit of info that you can that we can tweak it, but I've already got it. And like, it's going to be this structure that I impose on you. Whereas an emergent strategy is something that like, it's coming up and it's going, what works the best for the people who are already here in this room, and how can we create that together? What emerges out of our coming together and our collective action and our collective thoughts, because it's so much stronger, right? Like it has resilience because everybody is already like, everybody can see themselves in whatever solution it is that we're coming up with. We're not assuming that there's going to be somebody who's going to do a particular thing or have a particular skill. Like we're going to work with what's already in the room, and how can we use those lenses? And I think that it also really brings about the idea of like power dynamics. So power dynamics is so important. And when you have a strategy that's not emergent, somebody has dictated that, right? Like you have to come up with something, you have to work within somebody else's rules. Where when you have an emergent strategy, the idea is that the power and the wisdom is in the room, and that you just kind of harness that, and so you see where it goes. And a lot of times it'll go someplace where you didn't expect it to go at all, because there's no one person that has all of the answers.
It's an interesting thing to consider. It's a way to actually concretely think through what is an alternative to this way that we typically think about organizing, which is we have a model, we have a particular plan, and all we need to do is implement that plan in a certain way. And if we have the right people, they'll implement the plan and get things done, and then things will happen. It's this very sort of like predetermined kind of way of thinking about this. I will say that, whenever I read through the book, one of the things I found really interesting is this idea that we need to look to different sort of processes in nature and like biological life to understand how is it that structures and forms come about, and isn't anything that you can really predetermine beforehand, because the system is so complex that it's almost as if the only way to keep something strong and stable is to let it adapt like moment to moment as things are sort of changing within the environment.
So it says this is on page 684. When Hurricane Katrina slammed into the Gulf Coast, almost everything lost its footing. Houses were detached from their foundations. Trees and shrubbery were uprooted. Signposts and vehicles floated down the rivers that became of the streets. But amidst the whipping winds and surging water, the oak tree held its ground. How? Instead of digging its roots deep and solitary into the earth, the oak tree grows its roots wide and interlocks with other oak trees in the surrounding area. And you can't bring down 100 oak trees beneath the soil. How do we survive the unnatural disasters of climate change, environmental injustice, over-policing, mass imprisonment, militarization, economic equality, corporate globalization, and displacement? We must connect underground, my people. In this way, we shall survive. And that's a quote by Naima Penniman. Yeah, Penniman.
She's from Climbing Poetry.
What?
This band called
cool.
Climbing Poetry. Yeah,
All
they're
right.
amazing. I love them.
I will
Yeah.
check them out.
They
They
have
will go in the show notes too. Yeah.
Yeah, so they actually have a beautiful project. Her sister wrote a book called Farming for Black Freedom, and they have this whole land project called Soulfire Farm, and like these trainings that they do in immersions like on the land, getting like Black and Indigenous folks.
My housemate is doing Farming for Black Freedom.
Is she? Ah, I want to do it, so I know there'll be a moment at some point.
I'm happy that she's doing Farming for Black Freedom, and you can see that like her connection to land is like really in her analysis. But I feel like that was such a really like that quote itself is just so meaningful to me, because like you're talking about Hurricane Katrina, like this is about like Black people, right? Like Hurricane Katrina was awful, and we're still suffering effects from that, right? And then you've got like this idea of there are more storms coming, right? And they're not necessarily like climate change storms. They're storms that are kind of ever present and based out of like deep racism. And how do we survive all of that? Like how do we actually have resilience? And we have to be connected, right? Like there's this idea that like, oh, we're just going to do it on our own. And I think that there's another part in here that where she's like, charismatic leaders are not the things that are going to serve us, right? Like the idea is that you have to have people who are engaged and who can like be interdependent and who can think in different ways. And it's not just going to be like this solo person that's just going to come through and save us. So on page 52, it says we have singular charismatic leaders, top-down structures, money-driven programs, destructive methods of engaging conflict, unsustainable work cultures, and little to no impact on the issues at hand. This makes sense. It's the water that we're swimming in, but it creates patterns. And some of the patterns that I've seen that start small and then become movement-wide are burnout, overwork, underpay, unrealistic expectations, organizational and movement splitting, personal drama disrupting movements, mission drift, specifically in the direction of money, and stagnation and inability to make decisions. And I feel like I have seen just textbook. Like all of these are so classic Austin, right? We have so many people who are burnout working at like all of these nonprofits, even nonprofits that are supposed to be like doing the right things. We've got all of these nonprofits who like started out with a great mission and then like started to have only accountability to the people who are granting their money, right? Like we've got all of this, so much personal drama. I even have some. I'm like, I don't work with that person. Like, no, that's not what we're gonna do.
I literally just wrote down accountability to community because it's something that you mentioned when you were saying like, oh, something about the people. I don't remember specifically because I didn't write it down, but it made me think about that of wanting to loop back around to what that looks like. Anyways, please continue.
No, that's super real. And like the personal drama and the organizational and movement splitting. And it's so frustrating because Austin is in this really prime position where like a lot of the people who are in our government, like specifically City of Austin government, are ready and like able to be pressured to make better changes, right? Like the City of Austin is sponsoring Undoing Racism workshops. That's huge. We have a lot of ability to be able to make a pressure, like to be able to move this city, but like our shit is in the way in such deep runnels as to be like, I feel like either we've got like FBI informants or like they couldn't have done it better, right?
Yeah. In the Marxist tradition, we would say they are objectively FBI informants, even if they aren't really. So.
Right. Like they're just, all of those things are so clear and present in Austin.
Well, I think this is a really great thing to talk about because all of us have been involved for various amounts of time in like organizing, and we know very well how a lot of these things play out in our city specifically and how groups interact and the splitting and burnout and all these sort of sectarian splits, and especially a lot of the more like far left groups. I'm wondering, how would you all describe what it is about these sort of tendencies that either arise out of, let's say, like white supremacy or like just the general conditions of capitalism or patriarchy, or maybe, you know, obviously a combination of those? Because I think sometimes whenever I've been in these groups, it's really hard to make sense of, you know you want things to change, and we know that this is a really shitty way to do this and it's not working. And also there's very few ways, I think, for a lot of folks to think a different kind of future that would allow you to reconceptualize what it would look like to do this work. So I'm wondering how you all would maybe think about where these patterns tend to come from those different bigger systems.
Well, I know that I can speak to like something that Nakia knows, and it's like my motivation to want to organize and have like this deeper sense of connection that's rooted in the land goes back to like honoring indigenous traditions, right? Like being a gatekeeper of this medicine means making it accessible to the community. And how am I being responsible in that way?
Yeah.
For my 30th birthday, I had a bunch of friends that came through for Sweat Lodge, and it was so special. I haven't had an experience like that, you know, and the intention was absolutely that. It's like, how are we organizing differently, deeply, in a way that we don't necessarily know, right? That is like open to different beliefs and whatever way of thinking being okay. Because it has nothing to do with dogma or any of these other things, but really just like your own connection to land and space in that moment.
I would say that we have in the U.S. and she talks about it in the book, a really terrible way of dealing with conflict. Like we don't have good models of dealing with conflict. And like there's so much involved in that, right? There's like ego and boundaries and like the stories that we tell ourselves of why a thing is happening and our senses of justice. And oftentimes we're like, okay, if things are at peace, they're at peace. She talks a little bit in the book, and we talked about it a lot. That was one of my big takeaways in the actual workshop, was not coddling people. So we often don't tell people the truth because we're like, we don't want to have to deal with their behaviors and their emotions afterwards, right? And that comes from a non-dominant place often, because we know that we're going to have to deal with their feelings, and like they're going to be like, oh, I'm so upset that you told me this, like you're the bad person. It's kind of like when you go, hey, that's racist, and they're like, no, you're racist, and it's like, okay, or like you're bringing about division, and like you're expecting this kind of pushback. And so like this idea of like, we're not responsible for other people's behaviors and emotions, like those are the things that you control for you. And I think that mindset is part of it, but then there's also this other part where it's like, it's also an assumption. It doesn't give people a chance to like act poorly. It gives people a chance to like not make the best decisions for themselves. Because I know that when people have come to me and been like, oh, well, we didn't tell you because we didn't want to hurt your feelings. I'm like, I'm gonna hurt your feelings real bad right now, right? Like 0 to 60. Like, are you fucking kidding me? Like you took away my agency because you had some thoughts about feelings because you were projecting on me that you thought, no, right? And like, how arrogant do we have to be like, we're just not going to tell them the truth about this, right? And so I think that there's a need for accountability on both sides that's not there. I also think that there's definitely like a lot of white supremacy in the movement, right? Like so much, like the reason that Afrofuturism is so important is because in so much of our sci-fi, Black people just don't exist, right? When you look at the futures that like white people have created for themselves, they just don't include people that look like me. And one of the things that she talks about in the book is like, we need to have a future where everybody doesn't have to be the same, where like everybody can be different, right? And if you're not thinking about that, and you don't have to think about that normally, then you're not going to be making futures and creating opportunities for people to be able to exist in your future, right? And I think that we also bring the same patterns. Like there's this tendency to want to be able to say, oh, I don't have privilege about that. And it's the easy thing. Like when you don't have to think about things when you have privilege, right? You're like, I was able to walk into your house today, right? So that we can do this podcast. If I was in wheels, I wouldn't have been able to do that, right? And it's just small things, but like all of these bumps and these stairs, like there's only a couple of them. I almost didn't even notice them, but like that's speaking from a position of privilege. And like, it's kind of like learning a new language where you're like, oh, okay, yes, I can know these like a couple little words, but eventually, like, I'm tired of having to do this work, right? Like, I want to just be able to, like, do things easily and smoothly. I'm not sure why that's not happening, right? And so I think that there's a lot of work to be done about, like, looking at our privileges and analyzing them and owning them, and having to, like, doing the work of being like, oh shit, because, like, once you understand, like, how much privilege that you have, like, the current state of things can't stand. And then, like, there's also this idea of, like, there's this idea of learned helplessness, right? So, like, when you do understand privilege and you're like, you know what, this is bullshit, racism is bullshit, I have privilege about this, like, I'm a white guy and I'm gonna, like, fucking change this, right? Like, I'm gonna fix it. There's this idea of, like, you're not supposed to have an outlet to be able to do that, right? Like, you're not supposed to be able to be like, okay, what are the systems and how are the power dynamics? There's not, like, a framework and a place for you to go for that. There's a reason that there's not a place for you to go for that. They don't want you to do that, right? That fucks up the status quo. So, sorry, this is a very long rant. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you for joining us. Well, I want to come back to something I think you both sort of touched on. And, you know, my work is, I'm a social worker as well, and also I do counseling and therapy. And I work a lot with survivors of violence and trauma. And one of the things that we talk about as the starting point of a conversation is related to not only conflict, but also boundaries and all these other things you mentioned, which I think are establishing physical and emotional safety. And then how do we learn to trust each other, especially across difference? And I think that that is something that, to me, is one of the biggest sticking points in a lot of groups that I've seen. It's one of these things that we don't talk about the political work, the liberatory sort of project in these sorts of terms. And so it means that whenever these issues crop up, because they're foundational to who we are as, you know, human beings, we don't really know how to address those. We just sort of gloss over them. And I think this idea that we don't have good models of how to deal with conflict just completely undercuts us being able to move past those things and have space for people to make mistakes and learn from them and learn together. It's just almost like we have all these things that we have to have in place, but no one even, like, knows typically where to start even putting those things in place. And so it's not very long before a conflict comes up or some differences of opinion or ideas or dogma comes up, and the whole movement splits. And those things happen so often and so fast. But to me, that's what I see a lot of the time, is that, well, it's obvious why we're going to go this way, because we don't even know how to fucking learn how to trust each other. And I think I was just talking about this with a couple of good friends last night. It's like, how am I going to commit myself to potentially a very risky, you know, very uncertain situation of putting myself, like my body, on the line if I don't even know if I can trust you in a room of people who are all that we're supposed to be all, you know, comrades and like in solidarity on the same page. But if I can't trust you, how am I supposed to take any steps further than that? I don't know. I know we were talking about accountability to community, but all these other things. But to me, I was just wondering what you all think about that, like the importance of these ideas of, like, safety and trust, and maybe what Emergent Strategy offers as a way to kind of build those things with each other.
I think it's all connected, right? Yeah. Part of what was coming up for me that I really wanted to share, that I think she really highlights and makes a point to be clear on, is that having this lens on life of wanting to engage in transformative justice does not mean allowing toxic behavior to remain in your space, and really being clear on not making excuses for toxic behavior and, like, how to navigate that and things like that. What was coming up for me was this really how important that is, because I feel like she makes a valid point to mention how those same rules of, like, wanting to not, like, that people are not disposable, how that can create a dynamic in itself that is toxic. And I think that really being open about accountability and how we're going to navigate through these situations before they even show up is such a key part of, like, developing trust and all of these different things that maybe we don't focus enough on before diving deep into, like, political work and organizing work and all of these things, right? Like that foundational work. Because I know that I can speak to my experience, the circle that I was talking about earlier, and the work that we've done, that actually started from some of us going to the Zapatista Encuentro in Mexico and really having that fire of, like, wanting to start a collective and all of these things. And we wanted to start big and, like, right away. And really what we learned over the course of the year after that, when things didn't work out to really develop in the way that maybe we had ambitiously envisioned at the beginning, that it really brought us back to focusing on our own work and our inner work and our work as a collective and our work amongst one another, to actually be able to come to a place where now we're really solid and can move from a place of like, we've been through some shit together and we've worked through it, and we know that we're committed and that we're going to show up, and that sometimes that's all we can ask is like, are you willing to show up for the work and show up in a way that is committed to wanting to grow and be genuine about not wanting to be harmful? And that if that is so, that, you know, there's always a possibility for moving forward from that, even if at some points it looks like somebody not being around or this and that. But that's part of what I do too, is like community mediation, that way of how does mediation look different when I don't actually believe that we can totally have a neutral framework if we're not actually coming from a social justice lens, right? If we're not actually acknowledging that shit is not actually equitable yet, and it's not going to be neutral if we think that going into a room with someone who has a position of power is going to be the same thing, you know, and really coming from a different space in that way. And like, what does that look like? And incorporating holistic energy work and medicine and just a different way of moving through the world.
What comes up for me, and I wrote a couple of things down. So when I went to the Unlearning Circle recently, I talked with Juniper, who is a part of the Undoing Racism Austin, and a good friend of mine. And one of the things that she was saying was, she's like, for people of color, where do you feel safe? Like where, what are the spaces in which you feel safe? And I thought about it for a second, and I was like, I feel safe in groups of people who have a really strong racial analysis, who have done their own work, and who have been working to like collect their communities. Because like when you go out and you do your own work with your communities and you come back, we know the difference, right? Like if there's a white person who's like, I want to help, and I'm like, go and do work with your community, and then they actually do that work with their community and they come back in a year, it's totally different. It's totally different. It's very humbling, and it's also a thing where like they get all of the pushback and all the bullshit that I would have to deal with like hashtag well-meaning white people, right? Like the fawning or the like, oh, we're gonna tell them to change their things. Like racism is all around us. Like if you're not actively doing your own work, like don't tell me about like other people, right? And so I was like, I want people with a really strong analysis who have been doing the work long enough so that they come into the room differently. And I also need people who are having my particular experience, and I need them to be able to be comfortable around those folks. And that's a really specific group of people in Austin. And despite the fact that we have done so many Undoing Racism with so many people, there are a lot of folks who I'm just like, nope, I don't trust you. Like, I know that I can't trust you, because I know that if something comes up in the room, that like I'm not going to be protected, right? As a Black person who is in a very white city who has to navigate really white spaces over and over and over again, like it is really clear that like if somebody is having a bad day, like there are a number of options that they have to do with that bad day. And like a lot of times that option is like, oh, I'm just going to dump this on Nakia because like she is the person that has the least power in this, right? Like they're not going to believe her for whatever reason. Like I am the person who's the most vulnerable, and if I'm with people who are not actively looking out on the horizon for things that are going to be happening in that realm, then like I'm with people who I cannot trust. The other thing that I wrote down is talking about liberal identity politics. So a lot of times I feel feelings of distrust when I've got somebody who's like, yes, we want to vote Democrats, or like, yes, Black liberation is really important, and they can say the words, but they're not actually interested in doing the work to get there, or they're interested in doing the work in a way that's like very visible, right? And these are the people who like, if Black liberation was a thing that was possible, they were the first ones to be like, yes, you shouldn't have any kind of unfair treatment. But when there's an actual rest of power, when you have to make other white people uncomfortable, they're the ones who are like, oh, well, like I like your goals, but like we don't want to do that. Like that seems like they're the nice people, like they're the Midwest nice people, right? And then the other thing is, I feel like there's a lack of trust because we have these like really transactional relationships. A lot of the times, the people who are most vulnerable have limited time, have limited money, have limited bandwidth, are already dealing with trauma. And so when you have people who are just at their wits' end, they've got a focus, and their focus is going to be like, how can I, this thing is about me, how can I focus on that and fix that thing? And yes, there's that thing and that's happening to those people, but I can't deal with those people right now. I need to fix this thing, right? And then like maybe it'll be nice for me to be able to go and have a drink and like do something that's living life, but I don't see myself in those other people right now, and they're going to be fine. They're going to have to take care of their own things. And so when you have these like limited interactions and like limited resources, then like you do what is best for you to be able to survive. And that means that you don't necessarily, and unless you think of your survival as being deeply connected to the rest of these other people, you're not going to be focusing on that. Then there's so many things I wrote down. There's two other things. So one of the other things is like talking about friends in this work, right? I think that there's a lot of people who think of their organizing as siloed. This is the siloed work that I'm doing, and not like this is part of my life goal, that like humans are treated well. And like when you're doing activism and human rights as a side gig, that's not really. I'm not really down to hang out with you, right? Like if this is a thing where it's like, oh yeah, that's my hobby. Like no, fuck your hobby. Like this is my life, right? Yeah. And then the last thing I have is Black collective action. So when we had like civil rights movement, there was a huge amount of Black collective action, right? But it was just very, very integrated network of like, we see ourselves in each other. And it was a thing where that limited resources thing wasn't as much in play. Like we are objectively, poor people right now today are objectively poorer than they were like 40 years ago, right? And so like you can have a movement where we're like this bus boycott where everybody's on board, everybody's going to church, everybody's going to stop doing this. Like there's so much social pressure, but there's also a little bit more bandwidth, there's a little bit more wiggle room. If like people have to take, like if we have to, carpool, if people have to be walking, like we can work on that. Like we can have the resources to make sure that like if she gets fired from her job, we're going to make sure that this person is taken care of, right? We don't have that right now. Mm-hmm. We don't have the networks, we don't have the connection, and we don't have the resources. That is my very long answer to your safety and trust question.
that was very, very thorough and very excellent. Well, I was just wanting to pick on one specific point, and it was about the sort of like liberal identity politics issue. And I think I see this actually come up in groups that maybe wouldn't conceptualize themselves as participating in that. But to me, I always think that the deep underlying sort of systems and the way that we think about things and how we're socialized to engage and interact with each other based upon these huge systemic historical forces, it's very, very complex, and sometimes you may not realize you're participating in something, and you absolutely are. Like obviously that's like no huge insight, but I will say one of the things that strikes me is that coming from the social work field, it is a very, very white field, and it's very liberal, and it's very pro Democratic Party, and that's sort of the extent of like political engagement. And I will say that one of the things that always struck me in those conversations with other white people is that whenever you start talking about liberation and social justice and all these things, that once you have to push beyond just saying the right words, using the right discourse in the right way, but you start actually saying, tell me about materially how this would force you to change your life if you actually were to act on this, you realize that it is a very, very difficult hurdle to cross. The idea that it would fundamentally cause you to have to change your life is a thing that is very, very difficult to make that leap to that. And it's something that I think being involved in the social work field, you're always trying to push against that in some way, to just say, listen, if you really believe this stuff, walk the walk. Like, show me you fucking mean business then. And I, to some degree, like my thought about transactional sort of culture that we all live in is that it's very much about words and ideas, and everything is sort of disembodied from the like material concrete practices of it. And I think that is very much a part of the stage of capitalism that we're in, and how culture like works and how media works. It makes it very, very easy to just engage in this transactional way. And so to me it feels like from that angle, that's what we have to push on, is we have to push on how do you make these things concrete and material? Because the systems of violence and oppression have never changed just because people use the right words. It's like you have to force them to change through material actions. So I really appreciated you connected the dots to that, because that's something I think happens even in like very like, you know, much more far left groups. Like if we use the right words, if we say the right things, that's the work. That's what we're doing. And I think there's this weird, almost kind of like really contradictory sort of way that we're carrying around these like liberal sorts of ways of using language and ideas, thinking that that's something that is going to get us much farther than it really is. You know, and I think that's a hard thing, especially for a lot of white folks in like far left groups, you know, that they're really, really, I think, pulled towards that. So that's really all I got. It was just something that I feel like I see that a lot, and it's one of the things I think I'm trying to figure out. How do I talk to other like white people involved in the leftist movements and organizing about how do you push beyond that, you know?
I think what comes up for me is like what it means to not be like fully embodied in that, because I feel like the wall that we come against is the fact that like, and this is just my view, right? Like generally speaking, white people have not done the spiritual work of healing our history. It just hasn't been done, right? Like that we're literally in this space of being like, hey, what's up? Like you need to address this. I don't know what that looks like in your life, but like look for your roots, do the work. Like what does that look like?
Quickly, I think that's such an important question to answer for other folks that, you know, identify as white or whatever, because it's a really tricky thing to navigate of what does it mean to connect to my roots that isn't something related to the Confederacy or like white supremacy. It's really hard.
Or indigeneity, because the reality is that right now it's popular and it's like mainstream and it's cool to have this association to, you know, spiritual practices in this way. And it's like, no, but like you have your own roots and your own culture. And like Europeans have their own, like, look for that, find that, you know what I mean? Like, I think it's okay to receive healing and to support community in that way. And like to know that there are just some things that you do need support in as far as like energetically moving on and supporting that process.
I think that there is this idea of like just being better than those other racists. Right? Like it's not a thing where it's like, oh, I'm actually going to do this work. It's going to be, I'm going to do enough so that you know that I'm one of the good white people and that I can have plausible deniability when I go to heaven or wherever the fuck it is that I think that I'm going. And I can be like, oh, well, I didn't know about that thing. And like, I can just live in bliss. Right. And that doesn't serve us. Like, I don't need you to just be better than these shitheads. Like, I need you to actually do the work. And if you're not doing the work, then I don't really have a whole lot of use for you. Right.
Yeah.
I'm like, give up your money. Like reparations is a thing. Like pass it, you know, all that land wealth, pass it along. We're ready to tend to it.
But it's also not a thing where like, I'm not interested in you individually, like making yourself into poverty. Like I'm not interested in you individually impoverishing yourself.
Oh yeah,
right?
No.
And doing that like I'm a martyr bullshit that we talked about at the beginning of the conversation.
But like there's a lot of abundance there.
Right. I'm interested in you like changing these fucking systems.
Yeah.
Right? Like I'm not interested in you winning the lottery and then like, okay, I'm gonna just give this to these people. No, I'm interested in you doing what you need to do with your privilege to change the systems that we all live in so that like this can be better for everybody and not this little one-off thing. Like I want the Koch brothers money. Like I want their
Coke money.
I want that Coke money, and I want it to use like I want us to transform plantations into places of like higher institution for Black people that are just like I want to repurpose all of this racist bullshit into things that are like completely antithetical to what they were originally trying to create, right? And like I can't just use like, you know, your little lunch money for that. Like I don't want to take somebody's individual money and make them into a pauper. What I want them to do is I want them to take their privilege and their power and I want them to use it in the same way that these ATX urbanists are trying to be like, hey, these cars are blocking the sidewalk and we really like these scooters. Like you all are so mad about these fucking scooters and you're so ready to call the cops because somebody has like parked across the sidewalk and talking about, oh, this is stopping, you know, people from being able to be like in wheelchairs wheelchairs. Like, bitch, you don't know anybody in a wheelchair. Like, you are not out here advocating for, like, better sidewalks in general. Like, no, don't give me that bullshit, right? Like, y'all are so mad about those particular things. Like, when there's small little inconveniences, like, that's when you see, like, white guys getting real upset. Like, raise some taxes around here and listen to how much louder that is than the Black Lives Matter voice.
Well, something that folks are telling me about the other day that is like relevant to Austin is all these school closures. Mm-hmm. And somebody informed me about the other conversation being had of just like all these wealthy communities being pissed off that their schools are about to be ruined. And I was like, ruined. I was like, I'm like clearly in my own bubble of just like not informing myself totally if it's not through, I guess, this other person that just happened to bring it up. But
like, read are you on Nextdoor? These people on Nextdoor are an absolute mess. Like, anytime that I feel like I'm like, okay, you know what, we might be getting some work done, like, I read Nextdoor and like it's just like, oh, that's right, this is where we live, right? Like, it's just a whole different world. And I think that part of my work is trying to figure out, like, how do I balance that? Because I need to be able to know what's going on in that world and to remember that people are real shitty in order for me to be able to navigate those systems without harming myself. But also, that shit is depressing, and I need to be able to to guard myself from those things. So ultimately, there's another role for white people. Like, I need y'all to do that and like report back to me, like, if things, or there's something that I need to know, right? But like, handle your people.
There's one thing you mentioned too that I want to come back to that I thought was really important is this idea that whenever we think about the way that we get stuck in these kind of ideas of like, all right, well, these things are great in terms of like just saying the right words and being good white people, right? There's I don't know if you've ever read it, but there's this really great book. I think the author, her name is Shannon Sullivan, but it's basically called Good White People. How like liberal anti-racism is basically undermining every like real material attempt about overturning like historical systems of like white supremacy and racism. But there was something that I always thought was really crucial is that whenever you have a sort of like racial privilege, but also a lot of like class privilege, and you have these resources and you have this wealth, it is very difficult to push beyond the idea of just saying these things or like using the right words or like performing sort of allyship in a certain way, because it means that to fundamentally undermine that as a system, like as an entire group, means that you're going to have to basically challenge the sort of like class positions that you have. And I can tell you this is one of the hardest things to grapple with whenever you're talking with other white folks, especially in social work who come from that background, is because you basically say, well, listen, all right, you're talking all this shit. That's great. But let me tell you, or basically, are you willing to give up the place that you go buy coffee every day? Even that, just let's say you don't go to this place that's like gentrifying like the east side of Austin, that is participating in this larger system. Are you willing to at least not go to get coffee at that place that you really love every day? And you find that even then they're just like, well, no, like, why should I have to do that?
Right? That's right there. Why should I have to do that?
It sounds like when they're like, but it wasn't me.
Right.
And it's like, your ancestors are still you. Don't get it. Like,
also, you're still benefiting from all of these systems.
Yeah.
Right? Like, whose responsibility is it? Because let me tell you, I didn't come up with a race construct and put my ass on the fucking bottom.
Exactly.
Right? Like, this idea that, like, white people are going to come up with race and racism and, like, have all these fucking systems in place, and it's black people's job to clean it up and fix it? Like, fuck you. Like, go do your work. Like, you've been benefiting from this for years. Yeah. Years. The least you can do is, like, go dismantle these systems. Like, just handle it.
I guess for me too, what's so important about that is it is in itself like part of the system, or it's the systemic sort of thing that you're only going to think about these things in terms of this like very like abstract, idealized sort of way, precisely because part of racism entails concrete material like class positions as well. And that's what I think is really difficult is that, you know, most of us aren't, I mean, I think we do live in a society where like class is something that even now is like still like kind of complex and like not everyone really talks about it. So it's sort of interesting to be like, listen, if you care about race, then you also need to be thinking about class and how these relate to each other.
Absolutely.
And that's, I think, where the big break for a lot of the other like white people that I engage with comes, is that the link between those two has been severed. And so it's very easy to exist in this sort of like, right, I'm going to talk about being anti-racist, but only in this really abstract, idealized sort of way, or just so you know that I'm one of the good white people. But if it means I have to go get coffee at a different place, well, fuck that. Like, I'm not doing that. You know, why should I have to do that? And so to me, that's coming from talking about my people. You know, that's what I see a lot of the time, is that sort of relinking those things together and understanding how they interact is a huge barrier. And it's one of the things that it seems like that's where we need to put some focus, especially if we're interested in talking to other white people about, okay, like, let's materially change these things on a systemic level, and not just whether this one particular person or you in your one sort of individualized way are trying to redistribute resources. It's like it has to be a systemic sort of thing.
There's so much with that. One, I think that there's this lack of seeing yourself in somebody else, right? Like, if you challenge somebody who is a white guy in a business suit, and like cops are throwing him on the ground, and like, you know, doing all the same shit that they did with like Breonna King, right? There would be a whole lot of uproar, because they're like, I see myself in that person, right? Austin would be like, if you do that to those rich people, you're certainly going to be doing it to me, right? Like, they see that as like, you can't treat that power person that way, because otherwise you can do that to me. But this idea of like, I don't ever have to deal with that, right? As long as you're just nice to the police, like, they're not going to bother you, right? Like, as long as when I go and do this, it has a different reaction, right? As long as people aren't seeing themselves in this, then they're just like, oh, well, why should I have to give up my whatever it happens to be, even though it's really small and ineffectual. Shoot, I forgot the other thing that I was going to say about that.
I mean, really quickly, I'll just say that I think this really core fundamental thing about how we even see this, see ourselves and who we think we are and others in the world, that is a really core piece of this, right? This whole way of who we identify with and who we don't, and how we conceptualize that, and how do we even think through that, is a really fundamental part of this. And so I think that that's also a level of work that has to be done. It's almost, I mean, to sound super philosophical about it, this sort of like epistemological level of like, how do I know what I know? And if there's a break there between who am I and like who are you, and how I identify and who I think is sort of close enough to me that, oh, you are me in a certain way. I mean, this is like a deeply psychological process that's happening, and we have to learn how to engage with that in a really, I think, critical way to understand how these are also like pieces of what keeps these sort of like fractures between us, and then like undercuts a lot of this like larger level political work that we're trying to do.
Right.
Hot damn, that's good stuff right there. I'm already excited for part 2. I don't know about y'all. I mean, I recorded it, so I guess maybe I'm a little bit more excited because I know what's gonna happen. Actually, no, maybe that's not true. Ideally, you're more excited because you don't know what happens. But we get a lot more into similar topics. We talk a lot more about our work and how some of Brown's concepts and ideas and visions can really help us reshape the work that we're doing, and especially thinking about our ancestors and future generations. So I think you're really going to love that whenever it comes at you next Sunday. Don't worry, it'll be here soon. All right, y'all, until the next one, please remember to keep supporting the show, doing all those beautiful things that we suggested at the very beginning. Now, I put out a call for this on our last Michel Foucault series episode, but remember, if you, comrade listener, or any comrades that you have, would be interested and know how to do some graphic design work, we're looking for a new logo for the show. So if you'd like to hit us up about that and talk details, please email us at redlibrarypodcast@gmail.com. You know, we could go talk to a whole range of different people, but we want to keep this in the movement, you know? We want to have some of our comrade listeners be able to contribute to the show. And speaking of that, big shout out to all you comrade listeners out there across the globe for sending in your ideas for episodes, your contributions, your support, your listens, your curiosity, your questions. We love seeing that stuff. We love connecting with y'all. So please just keep it up. We're always here and we'd love to hear more from you. All right, y'all, until the next time, keep searching for those visions of liberation, those visions of lost futures. Let's keep pushing to collectively reimagine the world that we want to live in and figure out a way to make that happen with each other. Take care of yourselves out there. Red Library out. Peace.